So, we have been discussing polling bias in the U.S. elections as a demonstration of the concept of sampling bias, where when you sample things, if you don't do it randomly, then you get results that aren't reliable. And so the U.S. election has been a great example of sampling bias when you compare the actual results of the election with what the polls were saying would happen. So let's take a look at this interesting issue. Right? As we've been saying, it needs to be absolutely random. Just like data collection when you're working as a scientist. You need to collect your data in a totally random way. Right? It was notable throughout the term that the polls were bouncing around a lot. Sometimes if you went back day to day and you're looking at the average of all of the major US pollsters, within a day or between days, the numbers would bounce around way too much. This is a bad sign for quality, right? And of course, we've all seen the election results. People have been talking about how the pollsters were so wrong, right? So how can we explain why the pollsters were wrong? And how were they wrong? Like in what kind of a way? So we're going to be discussing that in this little presentation. So it's noteworthy that when you run a poll, there's a lot of people that you can't contact in a poll, right? Some of them live in cell phone dead zones. They live very rurally, or they don't even have a landline available, right? Like a hard-wired phone line to get through to them. Some people just don't want to tell anyone who they support politically. Some people are suspicious of polls, the media, the government, and so on. Right, so there's a lot of Americans that these polls they just can't get through to. It's really noticeable in big rural states because there's lots of people who live rurally, very far from like where normal infrastructure, technological infrastructure, cell phone and landline infrastructure exists. So like who are some of those Americans the polls can't get through to? Well, you know, in lots of rural, rugged states, from Wyoming to West Virginia, you're going to have a whole bunch of Americans that we just can't get through to, and they show up on election day to vote, right? I wouldn't hazard to necessarily guess who these guys are going to vote for in the last election, but we might be inclined to think that, hell, maybe they'd be a little more inclined to vote for Trump than, say, Biden, or more inclined to have voted for Trump instead of, say, Clinton 4 years ago, right? So you may have some unusual rustic characters or something to that effect who will come out for the polls, and it varies by state, right? America is very diverse. There's a lot of different states with different cultures and whatnot. Florida, for instance, is an extremely important recurring state in the elections. It's often close. It's often considered a swing state, and so you might not be able to get through to everybody in a place like Florida either. So, maybe you're going to have some mullet-sporting gator wrestlers in Florida that live down by the swamp where there are no cell phone towers, or maybe there are cell phone towers, but they just can't afford a cell phone. But they still come out to vote, and they're probably disproportionately voting for Trump. But of course, this isn't a full cross-section of all of the rural living and generally Americans who you can't get through to when you're running a poll, right? There are some Americans who live on, say, a communal, organized, crunchy granola cannabis farm, and on the day of the election, they also come out from the woodworks and vote on election day. And you couldn't get through to them either on the polls because they live in a cell phone dead zone, and there's no landline on their low-cost communal cannabis hippie farm. Well, this isn't necessarily a full complement of the Americans that you can't get through to, but there's some illustrative examples for our presentation. So, let's take a look at the national picture across America. A very rough picture, right? Basically, it took a long time for the Americans to finally finish counting all of their votes with all those mail-in votes and whatnot. But as you see in the top right, this came from 270towin.com. By the end of all the polls coming in on November 2nd, Biden was predicted to win by 8 percentage points. But he only ended up winning by 4.4 percentage points. So that's a 3.6%, what we're calling a pro-Trump polling bias nationally. So that means that if the polls said 8% and that Biden would win by 8%, right, and he actually only wins by 4.4%, the difference between those two is what we're calling the polling bias, right? So it's 3.6% and it's pro-Trump. It's in Trump's favor, that polling bias. Now that compares to a 1.3% polling bias back in 2016. Whoa, okay, so it went from 1.3% nationally to 3.6% in one election. So the bias, the polling bias, or the pro-Trump polling bias, got worse. It got bigger. And so let's investigate by state, right, within each state, with an eye on where things are similar and where things are different between 2020 and. All right, so what we're looking at here is the polling bias by state, for each and every state, as a percentage of the local voting population. So in other words, if you took a look at Alabama here, it has a polling bias, right, of about 7 or 8%, right? So that means that if it said that Trump was going to win by 10% in Alabama, as an example, then he actually ends up winning by 17%, then you'd have a 7% polling bias. So that's just sort of an example of what you're looking at here. If it's negative, if it's on the negative side, right, that means that it's a pro-Democrat, or in this case, it's the 2016 election. So we'd be talking about a pro-Clinton polling bias. Okay, so it's noteworthy that by state it's very, very different, right? We have some states with a very big pro-Trump polling bias, and some with a more moderate pro-Democrat polling bias. And so it's interesting to analyze America demographically, right? Which are the states that have a pro-Trump polling bias? Well, look, it's Alabama, it's Alaska, it's Arkansas, it's some other examples: Kansas, Kentucky, Louisiana, Mississippi, and so on, right? You notice that those have a tendency to be states that we already know to be very Republican leaning. So it should probably come as no surprise that when the pollsters poll everybody in those states, that they can't get through to everyone. And of the people they can't get through to, there's a disproportionate number of them that are mullet sporting gator wrestlers in Florida, or moonshine drinking cartoon-esque country folk living in the Appalachian Mountains, or whatnot. These are the people that they can't get through to. And so in the states that point upwards here, these are states where those types of Americans that they couldn't get through to outnumber the crunchy granola cannabis hippie farmers that they couldn't get through to. Similarly, states that had in 2016 a pro-Democrat or a pro-Clinton polling bias included places like, California, Colorado, Illinois, Hawaii, New York State, New Mexico, Vermont, Washington State on the West Coast, and so on. So those are pretty famously blue states, right? Predominantly. And so it sort of makes sense that of all the people they polled in those regions, although there are still some Americans of all types living in those states, there is now a disproportionate number of blue-leaning voters, right? Of voters that are liable to vote Democrat, of my jokey version of those people as crunchy granola, rural hippie farmers farming cannabis. Right, so it's a joke, but it's ultimately the underlying idea that the people who are underpolled in the blue states tend to be blue state leaning. Well, no surprise there, right? Okay, so that was 2016. We just talked about how the pro-Trump polling bias nationally got a lot bigger. So what happened to the per-state polling bias between basically having a pro-Trump bias or a pro-Biden bias in the 2020 election? Let's take a look. All right, here's what happened. Oh, wait a minute. Let's look at the samples that now have a blue state bias. It makes me want to sing a song. Where have all the hippies gone? There's very, very, very few states left that still had a blue polling bias, a polling bias in favor of the Democrats. Look, all we've got left is basically Colorado, and then and Maryland, and a couple little outliers, a tiny little bit in Mississippi and a tiny bit in Louisiana that are sort of bucking the trend, since those are Republican states, but the polling bias isn't even that big in these locations, so it's not really worth going into all that much. So that pro-Democrat polling bias almost disappeared, and almost all of the states are now exhibiting some pro-Trump polling bias. It's odd, right, that that things shifted this much. So what happened? Let's look at it. Look at the two plots right next to each other. All right. So if you notice that the general profile of places where there was a big pro-Trump spikes and whatnot still exists, right? There's still a general trend that an area that was solidly pro-Trump in its polling bias remains solidly pro-Trump in its polling bias. There were some places where that polling bias got a little smaller, and places where it got bigger. But it's noteworthy that the polling bias that was pro-Democrat, right, all of the cases that are below zero in this case, have largely flipped and become pro-Trump in its polling bias, right? The difference between what the polls say and how Trump actually performs. So if we look in more detail on a per-state picture, and as I was repeatedly predicting throughout the fall in these lectures for class, if we adjust for 2016 per-state polling bias, it became a very tight race, with many states flipping between the candidates over the lead-up to the election. So let's take a look at some of those patterns, comparing 2016 polling bias to 2020 polling bias. So many states have very similar polling biases to 2016. That includes places like Alabama, Arizona, Georgia, Indiana, Iowa, Kentucky, Maine, Michigan, Missouri, North Carolina, Ohio, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Wyoming, and so on. And that demonstrates why my prediction that the pollsters, the pollsters were calling swing states of Iowa and Ohio, were actually solid Trump territory. They weren't swing states at all. I've been predicting that all fall on account of assuming that that the polling bias from 2016 was going to repeat. And it did, except it changed around a bit. It repeated fairly solidly for Iowa and Ohio, which made that prediction correct. So many states that had a pro-Clinton polling bias in 2016 ended up with a pro-Trump polling bias in 2020. So example states were like California, Hawaii, Illinois, Nevada, New Mexico, New York, Washington State, and Vermont, and so on. So a major possible explanation for this is that many blue state Republicans wouldn't admit their pro-Trump voting intentions if they were called up by a pollster. And that seems plausible enough that the Republicans who would be more squeamish about admitting their pro-Trump support might also have a tendency to be Republicans living in blue states, tending to be the more moderate wing of the Republican Party supporters. Also, of a few, these are some of the most major points to deliver. A few more minor ones. A few states exhibited reduced pro-Trump polling bias. States that had quite a bit of pro-Trump polling bias, and it got smaller, although it was still pro-Trump in the polling bias. So that was places like Alaska, Minnesota, North Dakota, etc. We're gonna revisit Minnesota shortly. Additionally, having pro-Trump polling bias that increased the amount of pro-Trump polling bias by a lot, that was very rare. It pretty much just happened in West Virginia, where in 2016 the polling bias was plus 12.3% for Trump, and in 2020 it went all the way up to 21.9%. Now that's very unusual. I don't know how to explain it. Possibly West Virginians like racism, or at least the disproportionately the ones the pollsters couldn't get through to. There is a fair bit of evidence in the news about serious levels of racism in West Virginia, but that's just speculation. I don't really know what the underlying reason is for the big difference in polling bias. All right, so this is an old slide from September, from the first lecture that I gave on this topic for class. And I decided to reinsert it here to just sort of prime us for what we were talking about from the beginning of term all the way up to just before the election. So this course is, of course, not about making predictions. This is Stat 101. You learn the basics of statistics. So, of course, if you want, you can take a more advanced statistics course with me, and we'll learn about making mathematically informed predictions, which isn't really what we're doing here. We're just making a very basic analysis of seeing what the predictions might be if we adjusted for per state polling biases. That said, there were two main scenarios identified. One is that Biden can maintain a big lead in the national polls. At the time, it was 7%. It was predicted to be 8% by the time we had the election. The difference between those polls and reality, although it's going to be several points, he still manages to win by a big enough margin to scrape out an electoral college victory. He didn't do it through states like Ohio and Florida. That wasn't really the prediction I was trying to make, because when you adjusted for polling bias, Ohio and Florida were more typically Ohio was always in Trump's category, and Florida was often in Trump's category and in Trump territory when you adjusted for 2016 polling bias. The other main scenario identified is that Trump wins the election with the largest deficit in the popular vote relative to the leading candidate since 1824, nearly 200 years. And it was at the time predicted that we'd get about a 5% win for Biden in the popular vote across the whole country, compared with just a 2% deficit in his win against Clinton. So I was warning right from early on that Trump winning the election with the biggest deficit since 1824 was a major possible scenario for this election. All right, so what actually happened? Well, before we get to that, we're going to discuss where we got with predictions just before the election. So this was early in the day on November 2nd, before the very final November 2nd polls came in. And I had used 270 to win to create a map of predictions. The predictions were based on adjusting for 2016 polling bias and then having repeatedly seen what those adjustments would result in terms of the Electoral College vote throughout term, which was throughout the fall, from mid-September, a little before that, all the way till the election. And so any state that was bouncing around a lot, that was going back and forth, I ended up calling it a swing state. And states that were solidly in Trump category, like Ohio and Iowa, after you adjust for 2016, I just labeled them as Trump territory. And then we made an educated guess based on how often various states were falling in each of the categories, plus, basic knowledge of U.S. politics. So where did that prediction of a 269 to 269 tie, which would have almost certainly resulted in Congress confirming Trump as the victory based on the way U.S. law works? You can see my previous video. So where did we go wrong, or where did I go wrong in this prediction? There were 3 states and 1 district out of 56 total that were wrong. So let's take a look at those. First was Wisconsin. Pro-Trump polling bias roughly held in Wisconsin. It was 7.82% in 2016 and 8.5% in 2020. After I made this final prediction in the morning of November 2nd, there was a bit of a surge in the polls when the final November 2nd polls were entered in, and it increased Biden's predicted win all the way to 9.2%. So that's fairly high. Biden only won by 0.7%. That's what accounts for the difference, accounts for the 8.5% pro-Trump polling bias. So everybody was predicting Wisconsin. Whoa, big win for Biden. But I had predicted that Wisconsin would go Trump because throughout term, over and over again, Wisconsin was very often in Trump's category. I felt it was more often than the other category. I didn't do that systematically. I just sort of regularly throughout term would go back and update the numbers and see which states were flip-flopping between candidates and which ones the pollsters seemed to be getting wrong. All right, so Wisconsin, that was off by a little bit, but it was really close, and the pollsters said it was going to be a blowout for Biden. I also got Nebraska's 2nd district wrong, so that would be right here. It's in this spot on the map, right, this guy, as well as it's also these lines, right, pictured on the plot. So that's just like the suburbs of Omaha. It's like one little riding, we use that word in Canada, riding, one little congressional district, except it's it's a special district that has its own electoral college vote, separate from the rest of Nebraska. So this had gone to Trump previously. Biden was predicted to win by 3%. When I did searches online, I couldn't get much info on the actual election results to find out exactly what the win for Biden was in that as a percentage in that area. So that's a bit of missing information. Georgia was a surprise. So Georgia had its state polls, level polls, be accurate. That was very unusual, very, very unusual across America. If you go back to my previous plots, An accurate poll would mean that you have no bias. You have a 0% polling bias. And Georgia was one of the very, very few places with a close to 0% polling bias across the entire United States. So a tiny Biden win by 0.2% was predicted, and he won by that much, and that is also nearly unprecedented in the U.S. South, that the Democrats were able to take one of these states that we call part of the American South, or maybe Arkansas counts and whatnot. I don't know what you want to call the South exactly, but Georgia is definitely smack in the middle of it. Finally is Minnesota. This is where my biggest mistake came from 2016 to 2020 polling bias. So note that there was once a giant pro-Trump polling bias in Minnesota. In 2016, it was 9.3%. Huge amount of unpolled support for Trump in Minnesota in 2016. But that polling bias disintegrated in 2020 all the way down to 2.6%, which is unlike neighboring Wisconsin, where it actually got a little bit bigger. Right, so I was predicting Minnesota to go Trump because of the fact that Biden's lead was typically around 8 points, 8% or so, and we knew he had a polling bias in 2016 favoring Trump of 9.3%. So it was pretty consistently all term that Minnesota was being predicted after the polling bias adjustment to be pro-Trump by about 1.5% or 1%, something like that. Anyway, that didn't happen. It disintegrated, that polling bias support. I don't really know why. It's speculation once again. I was wondering if George Floyd, the events with George Floyd possibly could have influenced that. So if you didn't know this, though, he's the man that was killed by police brutality with, he said, "I can't breathe," and a police officer kneeled on his neck until he died. Which is deeply disturbing, and it could be that Minnesota has a lot of kind of soft Republican support, where they were disgusted by the police. A lot of people in blue states and the more progressive types in America may see police violence against black people as kind of like an endemic problem of the U.S. South. And then seeing it happen in their backyard, might change their political opinions about things. So that's one possible explanation for this big deviation. I don't really know. Once again, that's speculation as to why this happened. So to summarize, there are 56 total regions with electoral college votes. 50 states, the District of Columbia, the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd districts of Nebraska, and the 1st and 2nd districts of Maine. And I managed to call 52 out of 56 of them correctly, based on using 2016 polling bias adjusted informed predictions. So you can go and recheck out my previous videos for that if you want more detail. And there were, of course, 4 out of 56 cases were mistaken predictions. Wisconsin, which is only 20,000 votes off. Georgia was only 13,000 votes off. And all of those cases, I don't have the exact numbers for Nebraska's 2nd district, but Minnesota was the only one with a relatively big number off of 230,000 votes. So, conclusions. The 2016 per-state polling biases not only mostly recurred, many of them actually got more pro-Trump. Very noteworthy. My predictions that it was a tight race were obviously correct, unlike what the pollsters were saying. In fact, had Trump received just 20,000 more votes in Wisconsin, 13,000 more votes in Georgia, and about 11,000 more votes in Arizona, he would have won the election. If he had won those 3 states, he would have tied Biden 269 to 269 in the Electoral College, and Congress would have almost certainly went with Trump, because Congress has a funny voting pattern. You can check out my other video. A funny voting pattern if they have to do this tiebreaker thing, or this situation where one of the candidates doesn't win a majority, 270 of the Electoral College votes. So noteworthy that if you add those up, that's just 44,000 votes. We had 155 million Americans voting in the last election, and there were just 44,000 key votes placed in these states, Wisconsin, Georgia, and Arizona. Those additional votes would have changed the election outcome. So that is it's the smallest number of votes to change the election outcome, in my opinion, from what I could see, and it's 0.028% of the U.S. electorate. Just 0.028% off from an electoral college tie and Trump winning victory through Congress. So Trump was only 0.028% away from winning the election with the biggest deficit in the popular vote since 1824. So right at the beginning of term, I announced that there was a serious concern, a serious chance, a serious probability that Trump would end up winning the election with the biggest deficit in the popular vote since 1824. He was 44,000 votes away from that prediction. So I was pretty darn close. And what else can we conclude from this? Polling bias is important. And per state polling bias is even more important. Biden, it's also noteworthy, had a lot of regionally lopsided support in blue states, resulting in lots of wasted votes in the Electoral College system. Basically, if you beat your opponent by one vote, you get all the Electoral College votes in a given state, for almost every state, right? But if you win that state by a margin of 30 points, right? If you win Vermont 30% more than your opponent, you still get all of Vermont's votes that you would have got had you only won by one vote. So those extra votes that you had, relative to only winning by one vote, is sort of wasted, right? You didn't need those extra votes. And if you've been able to move those extra votes from that you didn't need in New York and California to states like Wisconsin, Georgia, and of course Arizona, then Biden's victory would have been solid. Trump would have been nowhere near it. So it's just an understanding of how the U.S. Electoral College system works. That it's not beneficial to have an enormous amount of lopsided regional support. It's better to appeal, as equally as you can across the states, it would seem. So anyway, as I had said, I thought this would be sort of win-lose or lose-win on account of, Trump's a difficult neighbor for Canadians up here. And so it's hopeful that, the next president will be a better neighbor. And so there's an obvious lose side, win side based on the election outcome. And then there's a lose-win side based on, I like getting my statistical analyses accurate. So somehow this almost looked like a win-win. My predictions were close enough to have at least some pride in this analysis. And the election outcome is welcome. Hopefully Biden will be doing a much better job than last time. Fingers crossed. Can't predict the future, right? So I predicted it would take a long time to sort this out due to Congress, etc. Instead, it has taken lots of time for the courts to effectively reject Trump's legal shenanigans. And hopefully we've now pretty much seen the end of that. We'll wait and see. So in conclusion, for our statistics students, for our Stat 101 class, remember to always do your best to use random sampling. Without it, your experiments could end up with the quality of these US pollsters, which was not a high quality example. So that, excuse me, that's it for the presentation. Just some citations for some of the images that I used in the talk. Thanks a lot. I hope you enjoyed it.